Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, sponsored by Logos Bible Software, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. And today we're doing a book club episode with Collin Hansen. We're going to introduce Collin here in a moment and who he is. But the reason why we're doing book club today is he wrote a book on Timothy Keller. And so here's, for the YouTube audience, you can see the cover of the book. And it's called Timothy Keller, His Spiritual and Intellectual Formation by Collin Hansen, obviously. And so in our show notes, there's going to be a link to Zondervan. Click that link, get this book. There's also going to be in our show notes some other information, of course, because this conversation is about Tim Keller. And we're going to have TimothyKeller.com is a link on our show notes, so you can check out his webpage. And then also just maybe some other books and works that both have touched myself and Peter. They're from Timothy Keller. Here for myself, since I'm talking right now, I'll just bring it up. There's The Reason for God. We'll put that in our show notes so you guys can check it out. I'm also in the middle of listening to the audio version, the audible version of The Meaning of Marriage. It was recommended to us as a helpful resource. And then there's some other Tim Keller books that I've personally read, but I'll let also Peter include his if he wants to bring them up during the show or just put them in the show notes. But there's also some other information in our show notes as well. You can find more resources about Collin Hansen, where to find him, and then also how to find a Reformed confessional church near your area. So you click this link and you type in your zip code, and the closest Reformed or confessional churches come up near you. And then just basic reminders of how to get a hold of Peter or myself with any questions and comments. We're on Twitter and Instagram. We're email address is guiltgracepod@gmail.com. And then you can find these conversations via video on YouTube as well. And then obviously some information about our Bridge Builder sponsors, especially Logos Bible Software, our main sponsor. So let's jump in. Let's have Mr. Peter Bell introduce Collin Hansen today.
Yep, we have Collin Hansen, serves as Vice President of Content and Editor-in-Chief of the Gospel Coalition. Also hosts another podcast, Gospelbound podcast, which we'll talk about too, and I highly recommend that as well. He's written and edited many books, earned his MDiv at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and an undergrad degree in journalism history from Northwestern. Also an adjunct professor of apologetics and co-chair of the advisory board at Beeson Divinity School in Birmingham, Alabama. It is a pleasure having you on our show, Mr. Collin Hansen.
Hey, thanks, guys. It's glad to be back, right?
That's right. Yeah, I was sometime 2 summers ago, which is crazy. In 2021, we had you and Dr. Lehman on for the
Rediscover Church.
Rediscover Church. Yep. Yeah, totally. So it's a pleasure talking to you again, and you decided to come back on our show for some reason.
You wanted to meet me because I wasn't able to do that one.
That's right.
Yeah, Nick was conveniently absent last time, and Colin's like, we have to do this again. And we're like, okay, if you insist,
get the full experience. The full experience.
Yep. So if people haven't new or haven't listened to anything you've done, or maybe don't know who you are, let our listeners know a little bit about yourself, your background, and what you do.
Yeah, so most of my days are occupied with the Gospel Coalition. We're a site, an international site. We serve church leaders, whether that be parents all the way to pastors, anybody who's trying to help the next generation grow in their knowledge and their love of God, and to share that love with others. So that's how I spend most of my time. Before that, you mentioned, I've been doing that now. This is going on my 13th year.
Dang.
And in that role, I get to do a lot of things, whether it's our books or our podcasts, as you mentioned, Gospelbound in there, to our conferences. Recently launched our TGC 23 event in September, which is really exciting, with about 80 or so speakers, Indianapolis, end of September. And so I work on that and do a lot of speaking and writing in general. So yeah, before that I was, of course, heavily involved in our church. My wife is works in women's ministry, got 3 kids ranging from 1 to 8. And so we have a nice, we're grateful for a full life.
And you go to Iron City. Is that where Isaac Adams, is that where he preaches?
Yes. So Isaac Adams is our new pastor, and that's who my wife works for. And it's just Isaac's a good friend going back over the years, and really grateful for him at our church, and just really grateful for him to be in Birmingham. It's,
totally.
It's a wonderful situation.
Yeah, we had him on almost exactly a year ago to talk about his Talking About Race book. So we loved having him on. He seems like a great guy.
Yeah, he really is very, very insightful, excellent preacher, great leader, and just we're like I said, glad for him to be in Birmingham.
Yeah, awesome. So we'll talk about this book, and I know people are saying, well, you keep on saying Timothy Keller, and I don't see him on here. It's because it's the title of the book, and if he ever listens, he's like, oh man, this like my mom's calling for me, Timothy Keller. But this is such a great book for so many reasons, but it's all of it, and I think others probably think this too. It might be odd in that I think biographies, people generally assume they're written after the death of whoever it's written by, but this is obviously not written after the death of Tim Keller. But this is also not a traditional biography, nor a festschrift, which is people kind of writing stuff that he was interested in, but a look on the influences of Tim Keller. So how did this kind of unique book come to be? And maybe also, too, why is it written now versus maybe a few years after this, when he, but when he dies? Yeah.
Well, I think the very nature of the book helped the first question answers the second question. So the idea came through the publisher in 2020 at a time of obviously global disruption for us with the pandemic. And I think a lot of people were rethinking things and wondering about things and wondering about the future. And well, during that period, very shortly into that, Tim Keller learned that he had pancreatic cancer.
That's right. Yep.
And so, with pancreatic cancer, to this point, it's not curable as far as we understand it. And so, and sometimes that diagnosis can go really quickly. And so, Tim is not the kind of person he just doesn't talk a lot about himself.
No.
And you don't necessarily get a lot of biographical details in his preaching or in his books. You'll get some anecdotes here and there, like his new book, Forgive. It really does not. It was noteworthy when I was interviewing him about that book that he doesn't talk much about his own experiences there. And so, but one thing that Tim does that's really different from anybody else you'll run into is he talks a ton about what he's learning and where he's learning it and who he's learning it from. And so really the way to understand Tim is by who he's reading and who he's been talking about and whose classes he took. And so he has a unique ability to be able to synthesize that information. Well, if that's the way to understand Tim Keller, that's one of his unique gifts to the church, and we know that he has pancreatic cancer, then the question comes, well, we want to talk to him about this. We want to hear, what were you thinking? What were you trying to do here? What was your aim with this? So, all biographies will start with how somebody was formed, but then they spend most of their time on what somebody did and what the effects were. And so what's different about this one is you get it traces through his whole life to date, but exclusively through those influences. And I'm not sure you could really write the same kind of book about any other figure.
No.
And so that's why the analogy in the book that I borrowed from Tim of the rings on a tree.
That's right.
Is so significant because he just kept growing, has just kept growing even to this day. Everything he sees and does, it's an opportunity to seek a deeper experience of God and with his wife Kathy. And so you can write a narrative about his continued intellectual and spiritual growth throughout a lifetime over 70 years. So that's kind of why we took that approach and why this biography is, or why it's just not like what you'd expect from a traditional biography, but will include many of the elements that you would appreciate in a biography.
Yeah, before Nick starts, it was I looked through. I think he's teaching a course at RT. He just taught a course, and he's teaching a course about to teach a course at RTS in New York about kind of cultural influences in Christianity. It was the first time I've seen the biography or the bibliography of the syllabus twice as long as the syllabus itself, and broken down. I was like, oh, this is a different syllabus than I think people are used to, where he wants people to kind of dig deep into some of these sources. Like, hey, if you'd like to talk about anything, here's 6 pages full of everything that I've read on this subject. Which
really more like a curated list of what he's read on it.
It really was,
not everything. I mean, Tim is an endlessly curious person. He not only has the ability to read more than the rest of us, he has the ability to retain it. And not only does he have the ability to retain more than the rest of us do, then he has the ability to turn around, add his own unique take on it, and then teach it to us. That is it's not kind of what you'd expect. It's not a typical gift. It's not a common gift, but it is a particular one for him.
Totally.
Well, and when I started reading your book, it's not completely surprising, too, because even from a young age, it's pretty clear he was gifted intellectually. I mean, he could read almost independently by age 3, I think.
That's right.
I mean, that's pretty... I have a 3-year-old right now, so I'm like, oh, man, I got to pick it up.
Definitely not. Yep.
Like,
but what's interesting there is that it wasn't his parents.
Right.
That's what I noticed in there. It was something that it wasn't like his parents sat him down
he just
and
picked it up.
Yep.
Yeah, and in many ways, his parents were fascinating people, but it's like a lot of situations. You couldn't look at his parents and say, "Oh, yeah, obviously you're going to get Tim Keller." No, it doesn't necessarily follow. So there was a certain
Tim Keller
level.
came from you guys, are you sure?
Yeah, I mean, at some level, there was a uniqueness there, and that his sister was one of the most helpful sources that I had in the book, and that was pretty clear from the beginning of kind of the way he was different, not only from his parents but from most other people in his community.
Yeah, and so this just kind of set up this conversation, since we're still pretty much in the beginning of this chat, and for a broad audience, if somebody clicked on this and they're like, who are you guys talking about? Who is Tim Keller? What is he known for? What is he doing now? Yes, he's still alive as we're recording. So if you can just kind of lay some basic groundwork of introducing him.
Yes, Tim Keller was born in September of 1950, and he lives in New York with his wife, Kathy. He's got 3 sons, all in New York as well, and various grandchildren. What he's most famous for is as the founding pastor of Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York City. Started that in 1989. The rare megachurch in Manhattan itself. There are a number of large churches throughout New York City, but not especially in Manhattan. That was especially odd at the time to be an evangelical Protestant church. And one of the marks that you can discern of Tim's influence is precisely because of the growth of other evangelical churches throughout New York and then in global cities around the world. That's really his top legacy. He's also the co-founder of the Gospel Coalition, so that's when I started to work with him in 2010 and began collaborating with him on books in 2007. Most people would know him, though, if they're listening here. They would have encountered him the same way you guys have already described, through his books. So he's had at least 2 New York Times bestsellers, The Prodigal God, as well as The Reason for God, both of them published in 2008 when he was already 58 years old, or 57, turning 58. There you go, Reason for God. But he's published, a dozen other books, ranging all the way from church ministry and culture with the Center Church, all the way to high-level apologetic engagement with the contemporary social criticism, the making sense of God, all the way to books on suffering and forgiveness, and on and on. Meaning of Marriage, you guys mentioned, one of his most popular books of all time. And then on top of that, his sermon podcast is routinely one of the most popular in the world. So many people may know him, not only from, say, going back to the sermon he preached after 9/11.
Oh, yeah.
But then also some other many other standout sermons, many of which have become parts of his books, like The Prodigal God, but also one of my personal favorites, The Girl Nobody Wanted, about Rachel and Leah in Genesis. Yep. And so one of them that I cover in there. So that's a lot, but that's gives you a little bit of sense. He's a Presbyterian. I mentioned Redeemer Presbyterian Church. He's one of the leading pastors in the PCA, which is not that old of a denomination, only about 50 odd years old.
Yep.
But
50 years old. 50 years old as of today, 73 to 2023.
Oh wow. Okay, I had no idea. Look at that. So yeah, there you go. And so, and not only that, PCA has its origins in the South. So him being in New York helps to show how he's helped the denomination reach different parts of the country. So there's your basic overview.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's good. And then obviously this conversation is going to go deeper. So we're not just stopping there, guys. Thanks for.
There we go.
Oh, okay. I got caught up. I thought it was cool too. Just random side notes. His mom was from, his family's from Italy. I think his dad's family's from Germany. Is that right? Mm-hmm. That's right. A little background there. And then, so we're going to talk about that. I don't randomly just bring that up, but it kind of brings up his young life growing up, particularly his mother. But, so Tim grew up in a particularly transitional period in American life. He attended college during this time period of, the 60s, early 70s. How did that shape Keller, especially during his time at Bucknell? So a lot of people might not know that college, but you can maybe bring that up too.
Yeah, small liberal arts school there in Pennsylvania, in Lewisburg. Yeah, so I think of any time in American history, I suppose you could accept the Revolution or the Civil War, but
of course,
1968 to 1972 to be in college. I went back and when I was writing the chapters on Bucknell, I had a soundtrack in my mind. I was actually just pulled up Spotify, like the songs of 1968, and it was helpful to kind of put me in the frame of mind. And so the number one song when Tim was starting college was "Hey Jude" from the Beatles. One of the most famous songs of all time. So that just puts you in a little bit of that perspective. So he's not a Christian when he goes to Bucknell. He's got a fairly adversarial relationship with his very devout mother, and his dad's pretty passive about a lot of things in the family and religion. And so he goes, but immediately, or pretty early on, is in part of the community in InterVarsity and Christian Fellowship. And to set the stage, it's the kind of the early stages of what would become known as the Jesus movement. Mm-hmm. And so this, at a time of the radical counterculture of the hippies and Vietnam protests, this huge spiritual awakening spreads throughout the country.
Yeah, it was big in SoCal with Chuck Smith at Calvary.
Yeah, absolutely. Calvary Chapel. I mean, we could talk the whole charismatic movement.
Yep.
If your church uses guitars today, it's almost certainly because of the Jesus movement, those kinds of things. And so that's it. Right there in the middle is when he becomes a Christian, right there in early 1970. And from there, almost immediately, you're jumping into controversies over the Vietnam War, controversies over the Kent State shootings by the National Guard, protests over that. And so he's gone from, essentially, think about this, he's kind of coming in with a lot of questions about race and integration, because many members of his family and his church would have been staunchly anti Martin Luther King Jr., which, by the way, I also put in there that in the months leading up to him starting college, MLK, of course, is assassinated that April. Robert Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, is also assassinated during that time. Right before they start, right before they start the Democratic National Convention, is total chaos in Chicago. So just a very tumultuous period.
Massive transitions.
So from race, and the jump from race into intellectual doubts. It's the height of existentialism, the death of God movements. So he's getting a lot of that, and Freud and things like that in the religion classes. And then from there, you're jumping straight into war and questions about Christian activism. So all of that would have a huge shape on his whole life. I mean, his seminary years were hardly less dramatic because you had the rise of evangelical feminism during that time, and Gordon Conwell was a very eclectic seminary in terms of its different influences. So, yeah, those years from 68 in his education all the way to 75 were profoundly shaping for his entire life, including his wife Kathy as well, where they got married during their seminary years.
Yeah. So you've already brought this up, and you bring this up throughout the book, even though he was introduced to this in the the late 60s, it still influences him to this very day. Is his approach to ministry and preaching evangelism is his time with InterVarsity. So what's so significant about this time with InterVarsity that continues to shake? Because it's not like it was the beginning of his life and he kind of forgets it or leaves it to the side, moves on with his life and has other influence. Though he does, he's building on top of this influence of InterVarsity. So what was so shaping about this? And I know there's some conferences and some books that he's reading at this time too, but maybe this particularly, how did this shape him so tremendously?
Yeah. Well, I guess one of the things I love so much about history, about reading it and about writing it, is that you get to see how things changed and why. And so, in part because of people like Tim Keller, we take for granted that if you're a young person who's really interested in intellectual questions about the faith, that there's going to be endless resources available to you, not only through the internet, but through books by people like Tim Keller. That was not the case for American evangelicals for the most part in the mid-20th century. And so one of the primary places that we're engaging with cutting-edge scholarship from an apologetic and evangelistic standpoint was the ministry InterVarsity, which got its origins in the United States, especially in the post-war period, and I write extensively about that. And so he was introduced very early on in his faith, and even before he became a Christian, to a faith that combined a warm, pious heart, also with strong intellectual engagement, and then also with a fervor for seeing other people come to Christ, a fervor for evangelism. That was characteristic of InterVarsity at the time, which was, and most of the authors and leaders associated with InterVarsity were from British evangelicalism. And so even when Tim later would start the Gospel Coalition, what he was really thinking about was the influence of InterVarsity from that mid-level period or mid-century period, and then from these books that he was reading from F.F. Bruce, from C.S. Lewis, from J.I. Packer, from Martin Lloyd-Jones, John Stott. I mean, those are the names right there. And John Stott, who spoke at a number of major InterVarsity events, including their Urbana conference every 3 years for missions. And we're talking tens of thousands of students would go to this conference. John Stott, I think, is the closest historical parallel to Tim. I think they have the most similar temperament and outlook on things. And so InterVarsity had that kind of shaping effect, not to mention the fact that the first woman staffer of InterVarsity, Barbara Boyd, at their summer camp out in Colorado, Bear Trap, taught him the inductive Bible study method that they became so famous for, in part because of her Bible and Life conferences. She taught that to him, and that became the foundational way, through close observation of the text, that he would preach and teach for the rest of his life. So you could just go on and on and on and on and on about InterVarsity, but it had a huge effect on his life, no doubt.
Yeah, and it's maybe unique's not maybe the right word, but I've heard you talk about in other places and just reading through this as well. It's not like he leaves some influences and kind of adds some others and kind of replaces them, but it's like he builds on top of them and doesn't really leave anything before that too. So is there something unique about that? Like why is he just building on top of this stuff and not really like changing things? I mean, he does change things up a little bit, but not like leaves things and then brings something else up.
Yeah, I mean, he's an interesting character in that he really didn't change his views on anything after seminary. So seminary was a time of extraordinary intellectual ferment and growth, and changed his mind, became a Presbyterian, became Reformed, developed his views during that time about a church, about fusing together some of the parachurch elements of community with the with the institutional church. So especially through his mentor Ed Clowney. So he basically just he settles on those views at that time. His views on men's and women's roles in the family and in the church, that doesn't change either. I'm not saying that's not the only way that it can be. You can change your views on things. But what I appreciate about Tim is that, especially in the internet age and especially the Twitter age, theology seems to be fad-ish. It's always been fad-ish to a certain extent.
The next big thing is what people are talking about.
There's a lot of hype, and so a figure like a Jonathan Edwards or a Herman Bavinck might get really hyped up, and everybody's like, yeah, I want to be associated with them. But then somebody over here says, no, I don't like them. And everybody's like, yeah, I don't like them either. And so it just becomes
like the crowd.
Becomes like fashion.
Yeah.
And so I like the rings on a tree analogy, especially because it keeps the gospel of Jesus Christ at the core.
Yep.
And the contrast I give is that I don't think is helpful is lily pad theology, where you just sort of hop and hop and hop, and you just kind of keep going to some new fad in there. Plus, they don't integrate with each other. That's the thing about Tim, is that they integrate. They're all part of the same tree trunk in there.
Yeah.
So I just think it's a good learning model for the rest of us, which is not – no one would ever accuse Tim of stopping learning when he was 25 years old. That's not something you'd ever criticize him for.
Oh, yeah.
But having a settled core of convictions is very beneficial in ministry when the circumstances change. So in some sense, he becomes a more mature minister in New York City compared to Hopewell, Virginia. But he's the same person with the same theological beliefs.
Yeah, totally.
His time at Bucknell was so significant because as he entered Bucknell, he really kind of changed by the time he left, in the fact that, he did have some doubts and while he was there, but then he came to Christ and gave his life to Christ while he was there. And InterVarsity was significant with that, and is becoming more involved in that, and then some friendships there through InterVarsity, helped him see the gospel. And then once he gave his life to Christ, he was really on fire for it. So you guys will read about that in Collin's book. But speaking about influences during this time at Bucknell with InterVarsity, he had a strong influence. One of his biggest influences, Edmund Clowney, former president, professor at Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. So what's particularly influential about Clowney's work and that story of their first time getting Clowney to come over to Bucknell and speak? And it really shaped Keller's understanding of a gospel-centered preaching.
Yeah. So Clowney is one of the figures that I hope the book will help more people to be able to get to know.
Same here, yeah, totally.
Just a tremendously influential and interesting and significant figure in evangelical history. So he helped Tim in a number of different ways. One, he's Tim's only ever personal mentor. So Tim is the only person, this doesn't even include Kathy, but he's the only person that would have known Tim at some level all the way from that conversion all the way through the New York City years, at least into an after 2000, 2001 range in there. So, Kathy's right in there at the same time, but so Clowney's one of the only figures that transcends all those different periods of time. And he contributed several different decisive changes to Tim's ministry. One of them was just his ability to engage in cultural apologetics and in traditional apologetics. Being able to defend the faith. So he came in, he'd actually studied existentialism, Kierkegaard, in his graduate education, Clowney did. And so they brought him in to talk about Albert Camus, who was a huge deal at the time in there. So he's able to do an evangelistic presentation engaging with the cutting edge philosophies and secular and anti-Christian philosophies of the age. But I think maybe the bigger difference that he made was that he turned around and led an InterVarsity retreat the next that weekend. He talks about the church. Well, at the time, Tim doesn't have any interest in the church because remember, he grew up in the church, but not with a saving faith.
No.
So he, like a lot of people, a lot of evangelicals, associated the spiritual dynamism with the parachurch, not with the church. So Clowney helps to put him on that trajectory toward pastoral ministry in the church, and just in a value in the church. On top of that, Clowney is also the person who recommends Gordon Conwell because he knows Tim is not Reformed. Otherwise, he would have said go to Westminster. So he said go to Gordon Conwell in there. And then after that, Clowney was Presbyterian but also evangelical.
Yeah.
And that has become characteristic of Tim's ministry as well. He's Reformed but also evangelical. He's willing, and Clowney was at those same Urbana meetings with Stott earlier. So, and then Clowney is also a connection point of Westminster's legacy, connecting back to Princeton and then connecting back to the Neo-Calvinist tradition, and specifically its work on Christ-centered preaching from the Old Testament. And so the way Clowney would handle the Old Testament texts in his preaching and teaching and help to find their ultimate fulfillment in Christ was something that blew Tim's mind. It blows my mind. It still helps so many people today. And so what we think about with Tim, with sermons, especially his Old Testament sermons, things like The Girl Nobody Wanted from Genesis, that was really stuff that he learned first from Clowney. Clowney not only came to Bucknell when Tim was an undergraduate, Clowney also gave a series of lectures in the spring semester of Tim and Kathy's first year at Gordon Conwell. And so I quote extensively in the book from those messages because it's pretty, and Gordon Conwell actually digitized them for me. I'm not sure anybody had listened to those things since 1973. I don't think Tim and Kathy had since they were 23. And it's just remarkable to go back through and listen to those five lectures and hear, so that's like 80% of what Tim taught was in those messages from Ed Clowney. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah. It sounds like, too, it's, as I kind of come into my next question and to kind of sum up, he's not like trying to do new things in ministry. He's not trying to introduce new innovations or try to kind of reinvent the wheel. And you talk about this a lot in your book. He's the first one to say, like, this is not new to me. I'm just repackaging what I've read or what I've listened to before. He's not trying to be new and edgy. Like, I think people think he's new and edgy, but he's just repackaging stuff for this current age that makes most sense for people who are in today's age, post-Christian age, or whatever people want to call it. Is there maybe something to where he's taking the best of what came before him and not trying to add to it? He's just repackaging it for people who may have forgotten this stuff too.
Well, and it's just the sheer number, Peter, of influences. Some of us might say, and including some say, I'm influenced by Tim Keller. It'd be a lot for the rest of us to say, I have like 3 people that are my go-to folks. Yeah. Tim has like 75. It just is. It's just it's remarkable how broad and how numerous those influences are, because it was pretty amazing how many times you'd see him saying something like, so-and-so is the father of my preaching ministry. And you're thinking, Alec Matier is like the father of your preaching ministry? I thought that was Ed Clowney. I thought that was Martin Lloyd-Jones. I thought that was on and on and on. But he learned so much from all of them. And I don't think many people would associate Tim Keller as being a big Charles Spurgeon fan, but he was, and read a ton of his stuff while he was at Hopewell. So, it's not only it's the number of them, it's the way that they seem to all fit together. It doesn't sound like like just radio static of confusion when they all try to get synthesized together. But the best example or story that I heard about this was from Louise Midwood, one of Tim and Kathy's closest friends. She was a student with them at Gordon Conwell, and she said that they'd go to class together, and then they'd all go back to Tim's dorm room afterward. Yep. And then Tim would redo the entire lecture, and somehow it would still be faithful, but have Tim's own perspective incorporated into it. And I use that as a way of organizing the entire book because there's no better explanation of Tim than that. He tells you what they taught, and you're like, oh, wow, I hadn't seen that. But then you think, this has got some sort of special Tim Keller spin on it, too, though it's not he's not just regurgitating what somebody else said.
And you mentioned some other influences, obviously C.S. Lewis, all the way to Jonathan Edwards, which was interesting. Is like two people that would not necessarily get along probably with each other in the same room, but he really appreciated both of them.
Yeah. Well, and the commonality he found in both of them was their ability to use compelling imagery as they were engaging with anti-Christian teaching and in their teaching in general. And part of that's because Lewis is writing, Mere Christianity stands out so much because he's writing for radio. So he's having to be so vivid to help
for the ear,
this. Exactly. And Edwards was profoundly shaped by the new currents in preaching that came through the First Great Awakening, especially George Whitefield. So you see a pretty substantial shift in Edwards. But Edwards is also on the cutting edge of basically scientific method, the Enlightenment traditions, empiricism. He's taking in the natural phenomena, so he's channeling those scientific currents and then applying them in extraordinarily vivid theological language, sometimes horrifyingly vivid the theological language in there. And so that's what Tim was that's what he was gripped by with both of them. They both became very, very deep mentors through their writings and whatnot, in part because they just have so much that you can be able to read. Tim is not temperamentally like C.S. Lewis, and or like Jonathan Edwards, excuse me.
Not at all.
And he's not theologically like C.S. Lewis. So it's just fascinating. But that's kind of the example that we might take for granted with Tim Keller, is that he will learn from someone, but not just parrot everything that they think. He'll grab and choose what he thinks is helpful from them. So an example here would be N.T. Wright, another Anglican theologian. Tim and N.T. Wright and Tom Wright would not agree at all on justification by faith alone and the reformational tradition. But Tim would, it's like his book on the resurrection can't be surpassed.
Yeah.
So that's just the way he is with everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, and so you also, speaking about influences, and this is not an odd influence, but I think it's not one that usually gets talked about with a lot of preachers and biographies. But you can't talk about Tim without talking about his wife Kathy. With so many influential pastors today, you tend not to hear about their wives often, which is unfortunate. But Kathy was also being the wife of Tim, but she's also influential on Tim, as well as his ministry partner. So what's so unique about not just their relationship, but the influence that she has on Tim from the beginning and then throughout his life?
I think it's important to understand that when you're talking about Kathy Keller, Kathy Christie, here's who you're getting to know. Number one, a woman who at age 12 and 13 was corresponding with C.S. Lewis. It's not like she was writing something incredibly profound, but that's how she understood herself. Their pen pals with C.S. Lewis. She was one of the last people that Lewis ever wrote.
Yep.
So you're starting with that. Second thing, you're seeing a woman who, John Guest is still alive today, and a kind of a legendary Episcopal leader, and he said Kathy Keller, Kathy Christie at the time, was the most effective youth organizer in Western Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh area. There was a massive Jesus movement / Reformed revival in Pittsburgh, as connected especially to John Gerstner, an Edwards scholar, as well as R.C. Sproul. So you got that. So that's the second thing. And the third thing is that most people don't realize Kathy is quoted in Elizabeth Elliot's book, Let Me Be a Woman, as one of the students. So that'd be pretty impressive if you're one of Elizabeth Elliot's students who gets quoted in one of her books, a student paper. I got to say, as a professor, that doesn't happen very often.
No.
So that's who you're dealing with in Kathy. And so she is undoubtedly a force in her own right.
Yeah.
And she and Tim's personalities could not be more different from each other in a lot of different ways. Their dependence on each other before God is just unlike anything else that I've seen before. They have an exceptionally, just an uncommonly strong union.
Yeah.
And there's just no way that Tim would have been able to do, I think, half of what he did without Kathy. And I don't think we'd have time in 10 podcasts this long to be able to talk about all the different ways that is seen and unseen. I mean, one of the illustrations people would use in there was that their close friends would tell me that Tim would forget to drink water if Kathy didn't remind him. And I was like, oh, that's an interesting metaphor. They're like, that's not a metaphor. That's a real thing. Like, you just forget to drink water unless Kathy gave it to him.
That's right. Yeah.
So it did become a good illustration, though, of how they work together. They're a team and a powerhouse as a team.
Yeah, and not to say this to kind of throw shade on anything on anybody else but them, but it's not, I guess, quote unquote, that they're just husband and wife and she's the ministry help and the helper of him, but which is true of her, but she pushes him. She's like an intellectual force beyond him who, like, not just bucks against him, but like actually improves his intellectual life, because he'll say in a lot of ways, like, she's smarter than him, that she's got some stuff that he doesn't have.
Yeah, they're just a good team. I mean, when Tim will compliment her, she'll push back on it, but the simple fact is that she understands him so well. They've been together for so long.
Yep.
She was a professional book editor as well during their time in Philadelphia. So it's just, I don't think every ministry marriage needs to look like them. No. And I don't think anybody should feel any shame if that's not what their ministry marriage looks like. For the hundreds and hundreds of pastors that I've seen, I've never seen ministry couples look the same from each other. There's just no model that we should be looking to. It's just, I'm not trying to say this is how it should be or has to be. I'm just saying this is how it is for them, and there's no way to explain what they have been able to do without that part.
And to double down, too, on the Meaning of Marriage book, Kathy writes a chapter in there. Whether you guys listen to the audio version or read the book, you're going to hear, obviously, their advice, counseling on marriage. So it's coming from stories between the both of them and perspectives and advice from both of them, including direct words from Kathy in a chapter.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I mean, all these years in New York, it's not like Tim and Kathy are not shy about their belief in what's commonly known as complementarianism.
Yep.
It's not exactly super popular in New York. But part of what I try to explain in the book is it wasn't super popular in Boston in the 1970s either.
No.
But they're disciples of Elizabeth Elliot, and so they're just not real shy about that. So Kathy's been one of the primary voices to explain and to articulate those views about male leadership in the church and in the home. But what I love about them and what they learned from Elizabeth Elliot is that while those responsibilities are very clear in Scripture, how exactly that looks is not so clear in Scripture. And so Kathy is simultaneously very clear about the wife's responsibility to submit, and that comes across in the book, and at the same time is not exactly what anybody would ever think of as a quote-unquote submissive wife. So
not at all.
That's the way it works.
Yeah. So it's speaking more about New York and his planting in New York and Redeemer, because he's so well known for that. But I think many people don't know. Like he had no desire. He wanted everybody else but him to go to New York and plant this church after Hopewell, after his time at Westminster. Partially because he didn't grow up there and he didn't feel equipped. He's like, I don't know the people, I don't know their thoughts and how they view religion, how they view life. But he had already read and was continuing to read people like Charles Taylor, Alistair McIntyre, Philip Reeve, Robert Bellah. And so how were these authors so helpful for him in coming to this context that he's not from? He doesn't really know the people, the culture. So how does he synthesize this when he comes to New York, where it seems like, oh, you're actually like, you think like us, you talk like us, you're reading these people, you're quoting these people in a way that most pastors don't do in their contexts.
So oddly enough, Peter, he really didn't add those folks until much later. So that was the surprise with me. I thought there would be a long reading list. Just knowing Tim, I thought there'd be a long reading list of sources in New York. And I mentioned some of them in there. Bonfire of the Vanities would be, from Tom Wolfe would be one of them that he read. But really, when it came to contextualizing New York, and it was just meeting with people. I mean, I love the idea that he's meeting with so many people at the Tramway Diner on
That's right. He keeps them in business.
East side that he keeps them in business, and they're, Kathy's got to call the restaurant, to get to Tim, because you don't have cell phones right at the time.
Yeah.
So I love that there, and so really it just was sitting down and talking with people, and it was talking with the people, especially from Campus Crusade for Christ, now Cru. It was talking with them about what they were seeing on the ground. So there was a sense in which he asks questions, he gets people's thoughts, goes back to his books, studies it, comes back and teaches it. That was really the primary way that he contextualized, he learned to teach. So it really was not until 2005, 6, 7, 8, under the influence of James Davison Hunter, did he start to read some of the works of social criticism that we've known him for in the last 10 years or so, kind of his 60s, more or less. And that's a lot of the work that I do with him today, and a lot of what I teach on, a lot of what I've learned from him and from others as well. But that's a interesting. It's much later, and I think Tim would say that he's still learning at this stage, and that we need to be training church leaders to learn how to deploy what these social critics are teaching in a more effective manner. So he got a few years. He retired in 2017 from Redeemer, so he got a few years under his belt. But I was pretty fascinated to see that Taylor does not emerge in his preaching until the 2010s. I was surprised. Now, keep in mind, A Secular Age, his seminal work doesn't come out till 2008. So that's right, or 7. Yeah, 7.
Yeah, right around his Keller's first book comes out.
Yeah, exactly, around the same time. So there was, he had been working steadily before that, and but yeah, he really did a crash course on that work in recent years, and that's just another way to be able to talk about Keller's influence, is that so many of us have become conversant with those voices, most of whom are Catholic, through Keller's work.
Yeah. Before Nick's last question too, maybe to dive into this a little bit more, even though he wasn't reading them prior to that time, it wasn't like he wasn't doing kind of social criticism within the context of his preaching and apologetic work. Because he's maybe how is he approaching some of this stuff? Because he's quoting plays, he's quoting New York Times articles and Wall Street, and he's quoting novels and stuff. And people in this area are like, oh, you're a pastor who's reading and listening and doing the stuff that I do myself. So maybe if you can talk about kind of that influence that he's had on people as well. Yeah.
So I teach this in my own course at Beeson Divinity School, but at the time you just didn't have as much of a sense. Well, let me take a step back. So you got the Jesus movement, and there's a lot of controversy about these young hippies. Do they have to basically put on a suit and a tie and listen to organ music to be a part of the church? And that debate rages, and those became the worship wars that lasted for decades. But the essential question that the church answered, they answered, no, they don't have to become just like the traditional way to be able to fit at some level in a church. It took a long time to be able to do that. But there were a lot of debates then about contextualization. Then add sort of the gospel, and this was Tim's huge influence on him here was Richard Lovelace, going back to Gordon Conwell. But then there was another. Then there was I mean, I guess the contextualization was the big part of that. Harvey Kahn then comes in at Westminster Seminary. He's one of his colleagues. And Kahn was part of the missionary movement with Leslie Newmigin of coming off the mission field back into the West and bringing the missionary mindset to the United States and the United Kingdom. And that's the other major influence on Tim, was helping us to see ourselves as missionaries in an increasingly post-Christendom culture. And that's what it meant to be able to quote these poets. Tim's thought was, it's good if I say the Bible says. It's better if I help them see that even your own poets say X, Y, Z. And that's just Acts 17, Mars Hill
He's getting
kind of stuff right there. So that was the basic idea. And so now we take so much of that for granted. But these were huge debates in the 1970s, in the 1980s. And now, if you had a pastor who only quoted, well, I mean, she's so out of date now, but like he'd quote Madonna in sermons. That would just be like, what in the world are you doing? But what I like about it is Tim kept people on their toes, because essentially he would quote the Village Voice, a very, very liberal publication, or The Nation. And then he turned around and he'd talk about penal substitutionary atonement. And so people could not peg the church as conservative or as fundamentalist or as liberal. And that's exactly what he was trying to do, was to unrest them, or just kind of unsettle them, I should say, to be able to think, what is this kind of place? This is not what I expected. That's exactly what he was going for in there. So he liked to keep people on their toes. And that's one reason why I teach through David Foster Wallace in my class, because so much of what he says about idolatry and everybody worships and the despair. I mean, of course, a man who killed himself. That's exactly the kind of stuff Keller was trying to do, was help people see that everybody is religious. Everybody is looking for something. Everybody's trying to fill that God-shaped hole, going back to Pascal's views and Augustine's views and ultimately Paul and all that sort of stuff. So, yeah, he just loved to find when somebody else was saying what the Bible had already said 2,000 years earlier.
It's so, I gotcha.
That's good stuff. This is a multi-layered question, so feel free to take your time or remind or ask me if you forget part of it. But lastly, what do you think makes Tim Keller unique or set him apart from most Reformed Presbyterians? And is there anything that, sticks out about his influences or his approach to ministry that speaks to so many people? I know you kind of answered part of that. And lastly, what do you think the enduring legacy of Tim Keller will be?
So the first part of that question, that was an area that Tim and I focused on pretty extensively. And he's borrowed this perspective from the historian George Marsden and his work on Reformed communities. And his basic view is that within Reformed Presbyterianism, and there are three different perspectives: a pietist perspective, a transformationalist perspective, and a doctrinalist one. It's pretty clear that in the transformationalist, it's pretty clear within Reformed Presbyterian circles to find congregations that fit one of those categories. Often you'll find churches that fit two. Tim was definitely a fusion between the pietist tradition and the transformationalist position, i.e. the American revival tradition of piety, combined with the neo-Calvinist, Kuyperian / Bavinck perspective on cultural engagement and transformation. But he also had a respect for the doctrinalist position. And so I think that's what makes him unique, that he understands himself in those terms, and he respects people who disagree with him or might have different inclinations. So the other young faculty member in his 30s at Westminster Seminary, when Tim was there in the early to mid-1980s, was Sinclair Ferguson. And Sinclair Ferguson definitely represents especially the doctrinalist position, but also the piety tradition. And so Tim could definitely get along with people like that. He could learn from, he could collaborate with. He just wasn't he's never been a factional type figure. And he was very much a disciple in this of Ed Clowney. So one of the most significant finds, I think, in my book was going back to I think it was the 1969 commencement that Martin Lloyd-Jones preached for at Westminster Seminary, and Ed Clowney was describing the shift in in Westminster from the seminary of the clenched fist to the seminary of the bowed head. And that's just something Tim Keller came to embody through ministries like the Gospel Coalition and others over the years. And so that's what sets Tim apart, is that he's deeply confessional, but he's also deeply pious and also very evangelistic all at the same time, and that you just don't normally see that combination. By the way, if you want to understand his writing, the John Frame's triperspectivalism is very helpful because Tim will touch on the existential. He uses a lot of counseling, CCEF, those kinds of resources, a huge influence. But then he also is big on the normative, just biblical theology, systematic theology, biblical exegesis. But he's also, he's the best of the best on the situational. Where this fits in our cultural moment. When you see him doing all three of those things, you understand a lot of the secret of that success, and why he's able to reach a lot of different people. And I think that, the legacy will be that, I guess one appropriate way to think about his legacy is that people will pick and choose. I don't think they should, because I think that a major premise of my book is that the synthesis itself, or at least the process of synthesizing, is significant, and so you can't have the Charles Taylor part without the Jack Miller part, because the Charles Taylor part without the Jack Miller part descends into an intellectual, just intellectualism apart from the changed heart. So at one level, I think we've got to take Tim and learn from how he kept it all together. But I guess at the same time, it'd be kind of appropriate with the way Tim picked and chose that. I guess at some level, that's what people will do with Tim as well. They'll grab the things that they really like about him, and they'll leave the other parts that they don't resonate with in there. But I think people will still be listening to his sermons and reading his books for a long time. I don't know how long, but I think that'll be the case. And I hope he's around for another 10 more years so he can give us more of both.
He's a great example of someone that is able to connect the head and the heart.
Yeah, that's exactly right. But then also remember, he wrote the longest. I couldn't verify this, so I couldn't use the superlative. But he wrote what many regard to be the longest Doctor of Ministry dissertation in the history of Westminster Theological Seminary, and it was about the work of the Presbyterian diaconate in mercy ministry. So it's not just the head and the heart; it's also the hands.
Yep.
He brought that together too. That was a major part of him. So I wrote a book years ago called Blind Spots. In 2015, Tim wrote the foreword for it. It was a very abbreviated, kind of like introductory level perspective on exactly what we're discussing right here. And I think you'll find that many of the pastors or other church leaders you look up to most are those who combine the head, the heart, and the hands. And I think it's something we should be striving toward as churches and as Christians, even if we're especially gifted in one way or another, over another.
Awesome. Well, Collin, thank you so much for coming on our show again, for talking about Tim and some of his influences. Nick was pointing out the book right now, which I have the PDF. I'm still waiting for the hard copy to come in.
You got to get the hardcover version with all the pictures.
I saw that on Twitter. Yeah, I was like, that looks pretty cool.
Yeah. I really wanted people I wanted them to see the first issue of Table Talk magazine. I wanted them to see the article Hermeneutical Nestorianism. I wanted them to be able to see that lineup for 1972 at Ligonier Valley. I wanted them to see his family. Yeah. See his mom, his dad, his brother, his late brother. We didn't even get to talk about Billy.
That's right. Yep.
But I just wanted them to be able to picture those places and those times. So I'm really pleased with the work Zondervan did on the book.
Yeah, totally. Well, it's been a pleasure talking about this and his influences, and both about Keller, but also kind of how he's influencing how that's instructive for us about our influences and how we can synthesize it and do better, not just work, but to know our context, know the people who have influenced us, and package that in a way that this current culture can understand. Even if they buck against it, at least they can understand it, which it sounds like that's a lot of what Tim was doing himself. But thanks for coming on, and maybe to close out, where can people find you and all that good stuff?
And just come on over to the Gospel Coalition or gospelcoalition.org, or just find me on Twitter. Handles just Collin Hansen, 2 L's, E-N. Collin Hansen.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thanks for coming on. It's been a pleasure. And hopefully in a year and a half, we'll talk to you again soon.
Oh, man, I better get to work on another book. I need a rest.
Cool. Well, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.